Welcome to today's combined Global History Laboratory and Global History Research Seminar. We are in Falun, and we are a large group of colleagues and friends who are going to discuss today Karl Schlögel's In Space Between Time on the history of civilization and geopolitics. I think we start by introducing ourselves, who will participate in the discussion. I am Holger Weiss.
I'm Laura Holsten.
I'm Martin Squazima.
Kristina Romlid.
Lars Waterfall.
Kristoffer Holm.
Peter Einarsson.
Patrik Hettula.
Kaisa Varjonen.
Hanna Hodac.
Right. We have all read several of the essays that Schlögel has in his book. The original book was published in 2003, and this is the English translation of the book. And I kind of will leave the floor open, because I think that, at least for me, when I both read the original version a decade ago, or even more than that, which for me was an eye-opener to how a historian could write and think about space and integrate a spatial perspective, a spatial thinking in his or her walking through time. Having said that, the floor is open. Who wants to start? We kind of throw in ideas about our first impressions, and then we see how we're going to progress. This was usually the best way.
Okay, I could start then, because this is something I was thinking about this morning when we sat and read the book, and we also discussed the phenomenon of capitalism on our way here. And what I really appreciate here is that Schlögel points out that capitalism has places. There are places that demarks capitalism, because so often it's an idea that we talk about that is thrown in the air. And so what I like is that he talks about the various places of capitalism, banks, stock exchanges, businesses, and so on. And also, and I'm now on page 13, he writes, to strike capitalism, one must strike at people. So he also pays attention to the fact that people make capitalism. And this, I think, is slightly contradictory to what he says in another essay at page 251. Where he returns to the theme of capitalism. It's in the essay about hot places and cold places, which I think are brilliant metaphors, which I hope we can return to. Schlögel writes, capitalism is the final name for heat and cooling, the last in succession of many historic names that designate previously unimagined advancements and golden ages. Then he writes, capitalism has set cities and people in motion, sent them on great migrations. It has wrecked the old space and produced a new one. It obliterates, shuts down, makes peripheral. It shuns entire cities, putting them out of contention. And here again we have capitalism as an agent. We have it as an agent shaping places, but I think I like it more when he writes about capitalism evident in certain places, because here the people have again vanished. It's capitalism that does things to places and people. Instead, in my view, capitalism is about certainly it's about places, but it's also about people. So we could also think about what industriousness or greed does to places, which would take it closer to the ground. So this is my first observation, which has to do with the conversation that Martins and Kaisa and I had on our way here. So I appreciate the places the spatial perspective on capitalism, because it's important that we have a closer look at what it really is.
Does it have to be a contradiction between capitalism being a system and that people are bearing it up? That is connected to places and bodies.
I wanted to start with something provocative.
Okay.
I think it's interesting because when I think about this idea, it takes me back to the seminar we had in Åbo with Patrick and Holger, where we studied Komarov's book. I can't remember the title of that book now, but Theory from the South. Yes, and there was a remark made about the kind of capitalism erupting in certain African cities in the 21st century, which he calls a very popular phase of capitalism. In a sense, capitalism has phases, so to speak, and that it's kind of like transcends and rebirths itself in a way. And what was most astonishing about the the description on the African capitalism which the Komarovs talked about was that phase of capitalism works well in a system of civil collapse, so to speak, and an environment where the civil environment actually, it has to be weakened for that phase of capitalism to be enforced. And so while Komarov speaks about this fetishization of capitalism and materialization of the abstraction, he also brings through this argument that the two-faced nature of capitalism as agency and also as a concrete idea has to be understood from that perspective, that, you know, while it transcends and rebirths itself, it still maintains its essence. And like I was speaking to Patrick and Olga the other day, that, like he argues, 9/11 from his writing actually found a way, or 9/11 was more like a challenge to capitalism, which in abstraction we might not be able to really grasp it, but the terrorists unconsciously found a way to hit capitalism in a space, and which makes the idea of space really brilliant. But then also from your perspective that, you know, as an agency, that it continuously rebrands itself, it expands the idea of this notion of moving space, transcending space in the language of capitalism. That's
I will continue on that note, because on page 44 and 45 there's also a discussion of the capital, and also David Harvey is here introduced into the discussion, where capital represents itself, and this is on page 44. In the form, capital represents itself in the form of a physical landscape created in its own image, created as use values to enhance the progressive accumulation of capital. Then later on, Edward Soja is introduced into the discussion with the city, the urban built environment, is embedded in the restless geographical landscape of capital and specified as part of a complex and contradiction-filled societal spatialization that simultaneously enhances and inhibits, provides new room, and imprisons, offers solutions, but soon beckons to be destroyed. And in this way of looking at space and capital, I see a lot of different examples in the urban environment, in city environments, where you have capital constantly changing the structures, the paths, the movements, the flows of cities, and there is usually a contradiction in what is planned, what is planned as a future, and then how it then the capital manifests itself in certain ways that can't always be predicted. Centers in urban areas might move with workforce labor. A Marxist would probably talk about the different flows of classes and how different centers and peripheries don't really coincide with the built urban environment. But yeah, I see a contradiction with a space described as the agent and the consumers described as the agents.
But is there a contradiction? Because if we take kind of the first observation that he has on page 13, as Laura underlined, that the word capitalism is not more than a system, it is a system that has a place, but also that we have in this discussion then in the chapter, in the essay, hot places, cold places, is actually kind of a ponderation, a discussion about place and non-place, and the movement from non-place to place and then again to non-place, where kind of as he says, capitalism is the final name for heat and cooling, but it's also kind of because on page 252, if you combine that, speaking of walls and buildings, we really mean human beings, and can take that observation with the observation that capital in itself always needs an agent. It's not an agency per se, but it has somebody doing something ultimately. It's not, capital is not per se the agent, but behind you have the human being.
This is what I'm saying, the place and the human being is essential in always when we talk about capitalism, we should bring out the place and the human being, and this is why I appreciate what he's writing.
So, but for me I don't see the contradiction in a sense, because then the ultimate, because if you take it back to the observation on place and space, and you have human agency, kind of as the starting point, and then kind of movement from a non-place to a place, and then again back to a non-place.
Yes, well, I think Martin's already quite brilliantly explained in what sense it doesn't have to be a contradiction. I just wanted to raise a discussion. That's
Good,
all.
yes, we have a discussion. Christina.
I was also thinking at page 48, he writes that we need a center of focus. To render a picture of the world, we need idea of a center of focus about histories attached to places. September 11th was, I mean, it's been said before, but when I read his book, it came very clear to me that 2001 there was still a lot of talking about that space has disappeared due to ICTS, but they created a space for where capitalism as a system is to be found. And I read Schlögel as that is something we need to do all the time. We need to create this center, the focus. And I suppose also when we read, write history, it's the center, the focus that is important from where, because he also writes about their space doesn't have an end, but we can find the center. The center might have an end and a beginning. And when he talks also about non-spaces and heated spaces, like to find the end and the beginning.
I mean, on that page he has this observation, which of course all our knowledge about history is attached to places. History takes place, and every history has a place, which kind of, his kind of very strong emphasis about to reintegrate into the historical narrative and the historical observations, or the observations of historians, of not only being an expert on time, the changes in time and so on, but also kind of being someone who becomes an expert of reading time in place.
I have to say, when I first read it, I was wondering, when, firstly, coming from environmental history, spaces are there all the time, and having been in this environment for many years, I thought, well, what's so special about this? But then I first realized that this was written in 2001
Yes.
or 2003, and also I realized what he wrote about space being neglected previously. I suddenly realized the difference between having the place as a backdrop, as so many historians do, and bringing it into focus. And I really appreciated it because although we have been working with this for a long time, I liked the way he put it, that it's been there all along, but we haven't made it an analytical category other than geographists, of course. So I sort of, his argument grew on me because I started realizing in what way space has been absent from so many historical accounts. But I have a question when we talk about hot places and cold places. He mentions many theories like Soja and Lefebvre and so on. He mentions Foucault, but he never mentions the concept of heterotopia. And I mean, what would it be in his reading, I'm wondering? I don't know, has anybody else
The problem with Foucault's heterotopia is a very short essay.
Yeah.
And Foucault never returned to that theme. I mean, Foucault, in a sense, he opened up a chapter with that essay, but he never developed that theme.
Yeah, but this man could have done it.
Yeah, okay, but
My reading of that is that it's integrated in the explanation of space, that space is heterotopias, or places are heterotopias. But yeah, I also thought about heterotopias in many I read chapters that could have been called heterotopias. So it was quite interesting to see that, is it a conscious neglect of this term?
I would more say that it's because he comes from a different kind of background. Started with Lefebvre and then continue with Soja and the kind of British critical geographers and so on, which I mean, Lefebvre has a discussion between him and Foucault, and then develops his own reading about space. And when you start with Lefebvre, you kind of Foucault is in the background, but it's also Lefebvre critique of Foucault, of kind of not taking into account space that more.
I thought that, Laura, what you said was really illuminating of the feeling you get from reading Schlögel, is that the backdrop disappears and becomes an agent. And I listened to a historian last week who has been working with geologists and geographers, and they had introduced the geographical place to his reading of space. And he said that the first time he noticed that there had been a shift in his thinking was that when he saw the James Bond movie Skyfall, and in the end the James Bond is driving through a landscape in, is it Scotland perhaps? And he said that the first time he took in the landscape wasn't only a backdrop to him, this beautiful landscape, but it had a history, it had an agency in itself, and that writing history, not only through reading space with as a backdrop, is something that is essential to understanding the complexity of time and space. It's a history of a deep history also, but it tells something about a continuity from a time that has a longer history than our very short history. Can you imagine?
Yeah. For me, I think you said something that I've been trying to unfold, which is the idea of the end of a center. And I think the concept of heterotopia challenges that in a way. That can a center really have an end? If we try to talk about how to render the world. And as global historians, we're trying to understand networks and connections and all that from a center or otherwise. But also the center, like we also spoke about capitalism, tends to rebirth itself. And I'm taking my work, for example, like in Ghana, Accra. It was almost a contested space for different ideologies. Before independence, it was like African communitarianism, and then we see fetishization of Nkrumah's socialism, and then we see a neoliberalism, and then this interplay on the same, what we would call a center. So I see that heterotopian idea as more of an introduction to this endlessness of what a center really could be. And then how we interpret it as historians also is also another interesting thing. Because on that same page he speaks about that even while we talk about the past and the present and the future, there are spaces. And there are spaces which we go into to work on research. We try to understand, analyze, write upon the past as a space, the near present as a space. Some of the futurists do, they go into the future space and try to understand. So that the concept of the endlessness of a center is something I think is very impactful for global history. That the center just keeps on, rebrandishing itself in its way, and we choose what aspect of this brand we want to write about. Each time we tend to develop a historical approach to that, and I think that's where space, to me, because since I'm really new to historical theories and all that, I think that's where space strikes me in the sense that when I approach history, it's more like I'm choosing my brand of a center which I want to work on,
Yes.
which I choose to work on, but not neglecting the fact that that same center, that same space has several other abstract brands which have culminated into what the present, or what I will use landscape as he wrote some other time, the present landscape actually has become.
I mean, one has to remember that we're not reading a book that is written in 2016,
No.
Which means that he kind of opens a perspective, and he opened it almost 20 years ago. But I still think it's very fresh, and I still think that what he kind of calls for is both in a sense, the headline of the title of his book, In Space Within Time, but replaced with in space within time, in place within time. What he actually is also doing, that's why he kind of is also very much leaning back to Walter Benjamin, which of course also was not very much read before, especially not by historians. Benjamin has a kind of come back since then. But what he's saying is that when we historians write about, let's say, whatever we write about, we tend to we are aware of that things are taking place, but we do not recognize, we do not read time in that place. And what he's kind of doing in these 436 pages is to give examples about how we can read time by going into places and by kind of doing a place-space analysis. We read time. And that's what for me inspiring, because that kind of when I now working on my latest book on Siemens strikes, is that we can, a strike it's taking place, and with a historical strike is, of course, it's quite interesting. Is that if we don't try to imagine what is happening during a strike. Usually when we write about a strike, we demonstrations, blah 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 blah. But how is it seen? And then when I open and I read the newspapers, or I read about orders given by the strike leaders, is that paint the walls. This is a kind of spatial manifestation in place about that historical event, which of course the next morning you paint the walls with your slogans, whatever and so on, during the night, and in the morning the police comes, or the housekeeper, and takes it away. But we know about these manifestations by going in that place. And if it would be in 1933 or whatever, when a strike takes place, in my case in Sweden, let's say in Stockholm in March 33, is that I know that the strike was visible in place. It manifests itself in place, but usually this is never kind of taken into the story. And by taking into account also these spatial and place manifestations, we kind of give a much richer analysis of that time. Or when I was working on this kind of simultaneous parallel stories, when I'm focusing on the international Siemens clubs, is that as I'm telling now you the story about the international Siemens clubs, yes, we can kind of imagine, but then I ask myself, where were they located? What were they looking like? If I would go into one of these clubs, what would I see? This, of course, becomes much more complicated, because usually there are no photographs, there are no kind of leftovers. But sometimes you're lucky and find them. But there again, combining Schlögel and, let's say, Marc Auger and his discussion about non-places, is that these places were at one point definite political places, but are not anymore there. They have become non-places. And the best example, of course, is, or good examples is, again, in Sweden, for example, both in Gothenburg and in Stockholm, such interclubs existed. But when you go to the addresses, you don't find them anymore. And of course, the narrative of these places and about what was going on is also lost. But again, if you go in and try to recapitulate and recapture this, we kind of bring out different stories and kind of broaden the time perspective, in a sense that our reading now of, let's say, this period I'm working on, the 1930s, we have a kind of hegemonic narrative, which sometimes takes into account place, but usually has it only as a kind of arena or theater scene of where things are happening. But then if you add these multiple new narratives that are going on at the same time, you kind of, as we were also discussing yesterday about, you add up more time and more spaces in that narrative. In a sense, you end up with as many narratives that are thinkable happening at the same time. Of course, that the challenge for historians then how to grasp that, but that's of course is if we would be able to write or bring back our analysis, our narrative in a three-dimensional kind of way, then we would be able to at least get the simultaneous happenings at the same time, and even one could argue in the same place, but not necessarily in the same spot. So if we have the place, but then the place, of course, contains of several in itself places. And there we could, if you bring in again Lefebvre or others, saying that if you try to control a place, you immediately have a counterforce. Somebody who is trying to kind of evade or escape that control of that place. So this kind of back and forth movement of kind of control, known places to places and so on, is something which has been very inspiring for me at least, and when I try to do my writings and research. But I think Schlögel, in a sense, having worked so long with similar types of questions, but when the last essay we read, Herodotus in Moscow, Benjamin in Los Angeles, is a kind of a way of how he's working. And of course, what he wrote about Moscow, he then developed into one of his books, the book on Moscow in 1936. During the Great Terror, and a kind of going into one place, in that sense Moscow, but reading the history of the Soviet Union in a sense of during that year, and again having this forward-looking perspective and not a backward-looking perspective, saying that, okay, we all know what is happening in 1936, it's the Great Terror, but how were people living during that era in a place? Of course, then it opens up because so many other things were going on at the same time.
Yes. And I was going to say that that's really interesting because for me, coming from future studies, it's always about practical. How do I, I'm almost new to history, but it's almost striking me in the sense that eventually what I'm doing is history. So it's always more practical. And so, like in this, on his chapter on houses, when he says the house lives longer than the people, and trying to bring that conceptualization in space. Now I'm trying to think, while we were walking, we were talking about the lady who, I don't know the name anyway, but she wrote the war in perspective, from the perspective of her family, a Finnish family. Yeah. And thinking about that, the time-space relationship as a family, as a house, and talking about, this is my playing with my mind now, but talking about past futures from the perspective of the house, probably pre-war, war, and after war, and writing a history of that period from the perspective of the house. In other words, the house becomes problematized, and history, the writing of history, spawns out from that. I think that's a new twitch to what probably I'm used to reading on history, like, history of the 16th century onwards, and it brings more spice in the sense that, let's understand the history from the perspective of this house. What changes before the war? What consequences of the war and its influences did the house have to adapt to, and then during the wartime, and then post-war time, something like that. So I think if this approach can be taken in as a perspective for writing history, then we see the power. I see the power of space, especially from a small unit as a house, and how extrapolating outwards from a house as a space influences the writing of history, so to speak. So it's really interesting.
I just read the introduction. But I'm thinking, and having read this and talked to Christina before we departed this morning, about the extent to which you can use this, but the difference between explaining change and describing history, because I think a lot about the spatial dimension. I know you can ask, and I have in the past, particularly as a historian of science, asked about, so science tells us that what's true in one place should be true in another. So, but if you look at how history of science evolved, you can see that it's locally bound in many, many different ways. So science is an interesting thing to follow if you're interested in space, right? But and then I've come to spatial aspect from that point of view. But so I like that idea about using house or using Moscow as a place and doing history. But that's the way of, to me, it's a lot about describing history, finding a way of describing history, but possibly not explaining it to the same extent. So the emphasis is on describing rather than explaining. And I know that there's much more to the spatial turn than that. But as you put it, and your example made me think that here the spatial dimension contributes towards a description of history rather than an explanation.
I'm very inspired by the discussions, and I argue that historians have been quite bad at working with space, in the sense that there are other professionals that are working with the visual, whereas historians usually struggle with putting the visual in writing, and that is the limitations of writing that is usually a sort of hindrance in making this three-dimensional or even four-dimensional space. However, as Schlögel points to, and other who are interested in space points to other non-historians who have used spaces. For example, you couldn't imagine documentary makers not using the visual images of spaces and places as a agent or as a component in explaining also, not only describing but explaining. Documentary makers only using documents from the archives would be a quite boring, maybe quite one-dimensional way of looking at something, but usually you have a person walking somewhere or walking into a space, which is in a way an interesting thing. Now in Finland they are remembering the war from 1918, and if there are documentaries on the TV, they revisit places that in some way symbolize something during this war. And some places are reintroduced and used in almost every documentary, and they symbolize elements in this. And as they are moving through this, they are also trying to explain why did a famine take place at a prisoner of wars. Why did this famine take place? Well, they explain it also by the components in that space, the problems in managing, controlling the crowds, the prisoners who were too many for a too small prison, and food that couldn't be delivered, and so forth. So there is a component of space being an agent in something that becomes a catastrophe. But so what I'm saying is that I think that historians can learn a lot from others who are also futurists and documentary makers and people who are using the visual and trying to, or map makers that are using already space as a component in explaining history or making up historical narratives. What I've been struggling with these spatial theories is often that definitions aren't really clear, and I noticed that as a historian who likes to have clear definitions, it becomes a struggle when like Schlögel says, use your eyes, walk around, be a flaneur, just sucking everything from your environment, and then putting it into a theoretical kind of framework and describing defining this. It becomes a struggle, and it becomes a discussion, an ongoing discussion, I would argue. We are also thinking, why not use heterotopias? Well, what is the definition of heterotopia, or what is the definition of place and space in this? On which scales are we working, and so forth?
I also liked the part when Schlögel wrote this, use your eyes, go and see. And I think to use space, I think one way of using it as a historian is, first you must have a problem, you must look for something, investigate something, you can't just spatialize, you must have a problem. And one thing you could do is use spaces that are contested, that people fight about. And I have my hobby horse, which I've told my friends here several times, and that's, you didn't, I think, look at the square downtown, the city square here. It's sloping, it's an idiotic square, you can't use it for anything, except it's a, what you say, kyrkbacke in Swedish. That's because the churches. And the square is a PowerPoint for, on one side you have the rådhus, you have the church, and you have the house of the miners, Bergslagshuset. That's 3 PowerPoints here on the square. And in older days the buildings were much lower, so these buildings stood out really. And when you come into modern times, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, then the workers united, created unions and so, and on the 1st of May they marched this way past the church on Rosgatan, it's called, and they held meetings at the square. That's the second good thing with the square. It's ideal for a speaker to speak at the top and the audience at the bottom. And if you don't know how it looks today, for 40 years there was a big fight about a statue of Engelbrekt, the Swedish freedom fighter from the 15th century. And it took 40 years for this statue to be put up. And there were several discussions, where should it be? And guess where the statue stands today? It was put up in 1919. Well, guess where it is? It's exactly where the workers' speaker stood when he spoke. So they conquered the central place for the workers, for the workers on the 1st of May. I think that's very symbolic. They took the place. You can have speeches there still, but now you have to put up with the then, in 1919, the nationalist history of Sweden. He's called the first Swede in those days. And there's an extra twist to this, which I have felt very personally. Last year, on the 1st of May, the Nordic resistance movement marched in Falun. They are neo-Nazis. And I think it was in the build-up of the march or the aftermath of the march, this square was partly occupied by the protesters of the march. And the neo-Nazis were on the other part of the square. They shared the square. And I was very angry because the neo-Nazis, they had the part where Engelbrekt stood. So I thought it was a slap in the face for the decent Swede, that this freedom fighter was surrounded by neo-Nazis. And there's also space that for me was sort of sacred, that was contaminated. And if I may, you have another nice example, not so sad. That you came off the train at the railway station, and when this building was new, when the railway was new, you walked on the promenade, it's called, and the promenade was from the modern railway station to the old church. Not the one at the square, but the other one. That's another sort of space you could use when you want to be an historian and investigate these places that you know are built for a sort of show-off purpose. The promenades are this. They were built in many towns in the 19th century, and you have also the city forest, the city parks, also a space that is dedicated to be a space. And many of them are not contested, but on the opposite, they are thought of being shared by many people. So, and in many different topics, we've read some of those people who study reform pedagogy in the 19th century, and they have made a mapping of where the schools in Stockholm for these girls' school where the teachers lived, and they have seen the area of this school and where they live. They're quite restricted. These people, these teachers, probably saw each other each day, and we have our special teacher we're looking at, and I've seen she's also living in those areas, so space is used, but only when you have a specific problem. That's why I'm a little weary about this text. It's so many words. This could have been 200 pages.
Laura.
Yes, I agree that. You always start off with a problem, and of course he gives these examples that are his examples and that are often from political history. But of course, the square, as you mentioned, enables things, and contested places, as in Christopher's case, also creates many possibilities. But I was wondering about Hanna's question about the explanatory power about places that places can have, and I've been thinking about it. Schlögel also writes a lot about mobility, and I'm thinking, for instance, about the bridge, newly built bridge in Crimea, or bridges in history that we don't know about, which has made it possible for maybe troops or individuals to move in a certain way. I guess there are many examples like that where places can actually explain something. But the real thing I wanted to begin was because Patrick said that there's so much that has not been defined, and this is in a way a bit vague. I'm thinking about the relationship between space and place, because he does not make a distinction. And there is a distinction, because they are two different research traditions. So at least that's one distinction I think we should make, because somehow when you think about place making, you can't talk about space making, but you can. A human being and a person can be involved in something that we can call place making. So it's something even more concrete than space, because spatial questions you can still sort of approach from the above. I get the feeling, and I wonder why he does not make the distinction.
We have to ask him.
Yes.
But the way I've been using Schlögel's ideas and so on is where I kind of see that the combination of place and space is that he takes two examples, the Berlin Wall and 9/11, where he kind of uses both a space and the place, the Berlin Wall, to make an analysis saying that if the Cold War has a place, capitalism has a place. I usually take as another example would be Sarajevo. And Sarajevo can be used for several spaces to be analyzed, but also kind of the tragedy of the impossibility, it seems, for, let's say, the multicultural project. Sarajevo as the city, let's say, where Muslims and Christians were living side by side up until 1992. Then it wasn't even possible. Sarajevo, of course, in the European narrative, is known for one thing: 1914, the start of the First World War. But Sarajevo is also known as the place where multiculturalism was possible, because it were the Winter Olympics of 1980 Because then Sarajevo was brought forward as the prime site for this peaceful cohabitation between various groups. So in a sense, one place, but with different narratives that we can think of. We can think, and we should think about multiculturalism and the possibilities of a Christian-Muslim dialogue, and also the kind of the tragedy of why the dialogue seems to be so impossible. And it's from the Christian side that it's made impossible. In '92, it was not the Muslims that drove out the Christians, but it was vice versa. Sarajevo was kind of bombed by the Serbs. Toledo, same thing. Toledo was seen as the site in the 11th century for a dialogue, but which was then made impossible by the Christian Spanish crown. Or Palermo. We have three sides of these kind of, where you had a possible space for dialogue, which from one part of those who were in that side decided that no, we don't want to have the dialogue. Which of course, if we take that place and spatial analysis to a contemporary narrative about the possibility or the non-possibility of multiculturalism, it really becomes a kind of problematic perspective, at least for me, about whether or not multiculturalism is possible or not. So I kind of, now I've been moving both from a kind of quite a concrete place, because I can go down both in Sarajevo and ask the question, where was the place, the actual site of where the First World War started? And of course there are two places. There's one place where Gavrilo Princip was standing and shot, and the other place is where the Archduke was driving in his carriage. And there are two stories, of course, now evolving. There's the one is the story of the Archduke, and you put a memorial plaque where the Archduke died. And the other story is where Princip was shooting, because then you would kind of commemorate the hero. Again, same place, different stories.